The night she discovered his affair did not explode with screams or shattered glass. It arrived quietly, almost politely, like a truth that had waited long enough and now felt no need to rush, because the moment she saw the message glowing on his phone screen at 2:14 a.m., a single sentence wrapped in a heart emoji, sent by a woman who did not pretend to be a colleague or a mistake. Something inside her reorganized itself with terrifying calm, and in that instant she understood something he never would. This was not a wound, it was an opening, and openings could be used. If you want stories like this where power shifts silently and justice unfolds piece by piece, like, subscribe, and leave a comment, because what comes next is not about rage, it is about precision. She did not wake him, did not cry, did not check the rest of the phone even though temptation screamed at her to scroll, because one clear proof was enough, and too much information too early would only dull the blade she was already sharpening. So she placed the phone back exactly where it was, watched him breathe, memorized the careless confidence on his sleeping face, and felt something new settle in her chest, not heartbreak but strategy. By morning she was smiling, pouring his coffee, asking about his meeting, laughing at the same joke she had heard 100 times, while inside she began mapping his life the way a general maps enemy territory, calmly, patiently, with respect for how easily empires fall when someone knows their supply lines. She knew his routines better than he did, knew when he lied by how quickly he spoke, knew his weaknesses, his hunger for admiration, his terror of appearing ordinary, and most importantly, she knew the illusion he lived inside, the illusion that she was safe, predictable, dependent. At work that day she requested access to shared financial folders she had never needed before, framing it as curiosity, growth, partnership, and he approved it without thinking because he trusted the woman who loved him, not realizing love had just changed its shape. Over the following weeks she noticed things she had ignored for years, unexplained expenses labeled as client dinners, sudden gym memberships, phone calls taken on the balcony, and instead of confronting him, she let him relax deeper into his deception, because people reveal more when they believe the danger has passed. She upgraded herself quietly, new certifications, late evenings framed as ambition, reconnecting with old colleagues, building a version of herself that existed independently of him, while he mistook her silence for forgiveness he had never asked for. The affair partner became a shadow she did not chase, because chasing creates noise, and noise warns the prey. Instead she observed patterns, locations, timelines, and noticed how recklessly confident he was, using shared credit cards, shared schedules, shared lies, never imagining those shared things would become evidence. She began keeping a private journal, not of emotions but of facts, dates, times, amounts, behaviors, written with the same cold clarity an investigator uses, because emotions distort memory, and she needed memory to be sharp. When friends asked why she seemed calmer, she said she was tired, and when he asked why she no longer asked questions, she said she trusted him, and that word trust made him glow with pride, unaware that trust had become the rope he was slowly tying round himself. She stopped arguing, stopped correcting him, stopped seeking reassurance, and in that silence he grew careless, believing he had won a war she had not even announced. By the time he finally noticed something was different, it was already too late to identify when control had shifted. Because the first rule of silent revenge is that the target should feel powerful right up until the moment they realize they are not. And as she watched him leave the house, one evening humming to himself, she smiled softly, not with bitterness, but with certainty, because the first piece had already fallen, and he had not felt a thing. As weeks passed, she refined her patience into something almost elegant, because revenge rushed is revenge wasted, and she wanted permanence, not drama. So she let him believe the affair was invisible while she studied how deeply his life was intertwined with hers, discovering that his confidence was built on assumptions rather than safeguards. She learned that most of their assets were technically joint, that many professional contacts saw her as the stabilizing intelligence behind his charm, and that several quiet decisions in the past had been signed with her name simply because he had never bothered to read detail. Trusting her competence the way careless kings trust loyal advisors, and that trust was now her greatest leverage. She began by changing small things that felt harmless, suggesting a different accountant, offering to manage certain payments to reduce his stress, volunteering to handle scheduling because he seemed overwhelmed, and he accepted every offer with gratitude, unaware that control does not always arrive with force, sometimes it arrives wearing helpfulness and concern. She noticed how easily people confided in her, vendors complaining about delayed payments, colleagues hinting at internal conflicts, clients revealing doubts about his reliability. And instead of correcting these perceptions, she let them breathe, because doubt is like moisture. Once it enters the foundation, it slowly weakens everything above it. The affair partner, a woman who believed secrecy made her special, began leaving traces of impatience, wanting more time, more promises, more visibility, and he, intoxicated by feeling desired without responsibility, started slipping, canceling meetings, missing calls, arriving late, and she documented every deviation with clinical precision. At home, she became softer, kinder, almost luminous, praising his ambition, encouraging his risks, telling him he deserved more than he had achieved so far, and that encouragement fed his ego until he started making bolder decisions without consulting her, decisions that quietly benefited her position while increasing his exposure. She arranged dinners where influential people saw her as the composed center of gravity, while he played the charismatic risk-taker, and later those same people began calling her directly when issues arose, subtly bypassing him, because stability is magnetic and chaos repels. One evening, she casually asked about the woman he had been seeing, not with accusation but curiosity, framing it as a hypothetical conversation about trust. And the way his face tightened for half a second told her everything she needed to know, including how certain he was that she knew nothing, and that certainty allowed her to push further, discussing forgiveness, growth, second chances, until he nodded along, agreeing with principles he would soon beg for himself. She began separating finances legally without announcing it, following advice she gathered quietly, ensuring that when the time came nothing would feel sudden, because sudden changes invite scrutiny, and scrutiny invites defense. Meanwhile, the affair grew louder, demands increasing, schedules colliding, lies overlapping, and she stepped back just enough to let gravity do its work, letting him manage the chaos he had created while she appeared increasingly serene. The first real fracture came when a payment she delayed caused a minor professional embarrassment for him. Nothing catastrophic, just enough to bruise his pride. And when he confronted her, she apologized sincerely, took responsibility, fixed it efficiently, and in doing so reinforced the idea that even when things went wrong, she was still the solution. Slowly, almost invisibly, she repositioned herself as essential while allowing him to appear unreliable, a contrast that others noticed before he did. The affair partner began threatening exposure, and instead of intervening, she subtly ensured that messages were sent during important moments, meetings interrupted, concentration broken, because stress reveals character, and his character under pressure was impulsive, defensive, sloppy. She watched him unravel in small ways, snapping at assistants, missing deadlines, forgetting commitments, while she absorbed the consequences gracefully, earning sympathy and respect from everyone watching. At night she lay beside him, listening to his restless sleep, feeling neither hatred nor sadness, only a calm sense of momentum, because the second piece of her plan was never about destroying him directly. It was about letting him dismantle himself while she collected the pieces that still had value. When rumors began circulating, she did not deny them. She simply expressed concern, confusion, quiet disappointment, and that emotional restraint made the rumors heavier, because nothing fuels speculation like the absence of denial. He started asking questions then, noticing her independence, her new connections, her emotional distance, and she reassured him with gentle smiles and vague explanations, because clarity would have given him something to fight, and she wanted him disarmed. The night he finally admitted he felt like he was losing control, she held his hand and told him control was an illusion, that trust was what mattered. And as he clung to that reassurance, she realized the shift was complete. The axis of power had moved, and he was now orbiting a reality she designed. What he did not see was that every kindness, every silence, every delayed reaction had been intentional, building toward a moment when the truth would not explode but collapse. And as she closed her eyes that night, she knew the next phase would not be quiet anymore. Because once a structure is weakened enough, it does not need force to fall, it only needs time. The turning point arrived without ceremony, which was fitting, because the most devastating moments rarely announce themselves, they simply occur and then echo forever. It began with a phone call she took while standing in the kitchen, her voice calm, her back turned, discussing documents he believed were routine, but which in reality transferred authority he had never thought to protect. And when he asked later what the call had been about, she told him it was nothing urgent, and he believed her because belief is easiest when it preserves comfort. By then she had already ensured that key accounts required her approval, that critical passwords had been updated under the guise of security upgrades, and that several professional relationships recognized her as the primary decision-maker, not because she demanded it, but because she had quietly earned it while he was distracted by desire. The affair partner, sensing distance, escalated, demanding promises he could not keep. And he, desperate to maintain control of at least one narrative, began lying more recklessly, which accelerated the collapse she had prepared for. She observed how panic transformed him, how his confidence frayed, how the charm that once smoothed over problems now sounded hollow, and she allowed herself one private moment of satisfaction, not because he was suffering, but because the plan was working exactly as designed. The exposure, when it came, was not theatrical. There were no dramatic confrontations or public scenes. Instead, it unfolded through systems, audits, questions, subtle inquiries that forced him to account for discrepancies he had never bothered to understand. And when those inquiries reached her, she responded with transparency, documentation, and a tone of reluctant disappointment. positioning herself as the reasonable party in a situation she appeared to be discovering in real time. He tried to regain footing by confessing partially, admitting stress, mistakes, misjudgments, but stopping just short of the affair, because he still believed that secret was the final card he could play, and she let him keep believing that, because premature truth would have limited the damage. As scrutiny increased, allies shifted, some stepping back cautiously, others reaching out to her directly for clarity, and she provided it without emotion, facts without accusation, timelines without interpretation, allowing others to draw conclusions that were far harsher than anything she could have said herself. The affair partner, realizing she was no longer hidden, contacted her directly, expecting confrontation, perhaps tears, perhaps rivalry, and instead received a polite, measured response, thanking her for bringing concerns forward and assuring her the situation was being handled. A response so devoid of drama that it left the other woman disoriented, stripped of the power she believed exposure would give her. Behind the scenes, consequences multiplied, contracts reevaluated, trust eroded, opportunities withdrawn, all triggered by information that had always existed but was only now being connected, and he found himself answering questions he could not fully answer, defending actions he could not justify, and facing skepticism he had never prepared for. At home the atmosphere shifted, tension thickening, his attempts at intimacy faltering against her composed distance, and when he finally confronted her with suspicion, asking whether she knew more than she was saying, she met his gaze and told him she knew exactly what she needed to know, and that ambiguity terrified him more than accusation ever could. The affair unraveled under pressure, the fantasy collapsing into resentment as the other woman realized she had risked everything for a man who could not even protect himself, and when she withdrew, he lost the last place where he had felt admired, leaving him exposed to the full weight of his choices. She watched as his world shrank, meetings cancelled, invitations stopped, his phone quieter, his confidence brittle, and she continued moving forward, attending events alone, presenting plans independently, stepping into roles that felt increasingly permanent. The moment of truth arrived, not as a revelation but as an acknowledgement, a night when he sat across from her, exhausted, and admitted that he felt like his life was slipping away, that nothing made sense anymore, and that he did not understand how things had gone so wrong so quickly, and she listened, not as a wife or a victim, but as a witness to a process that had begun the moment he underestimated her. She did not reveal the affair then, did not accuse, did not claim victory, because the goal was never confession, it was transformation. And transformation requires that the subject understand loss without being told exactly how it was engineered. Instead, she spoke about trust, about responsibility, about the cost of believing one can divide life into separate compartments without consequence, and her words landed with a weight he could not escape, because they described his reality without naming his crime. From that night forward, the balance was irreversible. Decisions were made without him, plans progressed in which he was a participant rather than a leader. And the life he had assumed was solid revealed itself as provisional, contingent on goodwill he no longer possessed. She felt no urge to rush the final act, because endings gain power from inevitability, and as she watched him drift further from the center of his own existence, she knew that the final piece would not be about punishment, but about clarity, and clarity, once delivered, cannot be undone. By the time clarity began pressing in on him from all sides, she had already stepped so far ahead that turning back would have required admitting a reality he was still resisting, and resistance, she understood, was the final shelter of the unprepared. The legal adjustments she had made months earlier now surfaced as routine confirmations, notices written in neutral language that carried irreversible consequences, and when he skimmed them with growing unease, she explained each one patiently, framing them as sensible precautions taken during uncertain times, never once mentioning how uncertainty had been created, and that omission forced him to confront the truth alone, without an enemy to blame. Professionally, he found himself sidelined, not fired, not disgraced outright, but slowly excluded, which was far more painful, because exclusion whispers that you are no longer necessary, and necessity had been the pillar of his identity. She observed how people spoke around him rather than to him, how decisions were announced after being made, how his opinions were acknowledged politely and then set aside, and she did nothing to interfere, because interference would have suggested allegiance, and she had already moved beyond loyalty. At home the silence grew heavier, not hostile, just empty, and he began filling it with explanations no one asked for, recounting how hard he worked, how much pressure he carried, how none of this was intentional, and she listened without correcting him, because self-justification is another form of confession, and every word he spoke tightened the circle he was standing in. The affair, now fully collapsed, returned to haunt him in subtler ways, guilt seeping into conversations, fear flaring whenever his phone buzzed. And when he finally admitted the truth to her in a voice stripped of confidence, she did not react the way he had rehearsed. There were no tears, no shouting, no questions, just a quiet pause followed by a nod, as if he had confirmed something she had known for a very long time, and that reaction devastated him more than anger ever could. She told him she was not surprised, not because she had been suspicious, but because betrayal follows patterns, and once you see those patterns, surprise becomes unnecessary. And hearing that made him realize that his secret had not been powerful, it had been predictable. He expected confrontation then, a reckoning, but instead she shifted the conversation toward logistics, toward next steps, toward what separation would look like in practice. And the way she spoke about it as an already existing reality made him feel as though he had arrived late to the end of his own story. Over the following weeks, she formalized what had been informal, stepping into leadership roles permanently, consolidating responsibilities that had temporarily fallen to her, and when questioned about him, she responded with professionalism, never disparaging, never defensive, which preserved her reputation while his slowly dissolved into a vague memory of potential unfulfilled. He tried to rebuild, reaching out to contacts, proposing new ideas, but found that trust, once eroded, does not regenerate quickly, and without trust, charisma becomes noise. She watched his efforts from a distance, not with pleasure but with a measured sense of completion. Because the goal had never been to ruin him completely, it had been to remove his ability to harm her future, and that goal had been achieved. Emotionally, he oscillated between remorse and resentment, sometimes apologizing sincerely, sometimes accusing her of coldness, manipulation, of planning too far ahead. And when he accused her of strategy, she neither confirmed nor denied it. She simply said that survival requires awareness, and awareness requires preparation, and that answer left him without ground to stand on. The public narrative settled into something gentle and final, to people growing apart, mutual respect, different paths. And because she never challenged that narrative, it became accepted truth, while his internal narrative remained chaotic, fragmented, full of unanswered questions about when exactly he lost control. He asked once, late at night, when the house was nearly empty, whether she had ever loved him, and she answered honestly that she had, deeply, but that love does not survive contempt, and contempt often arrives disguised as entitlement, and hearing that forced him to confront a version of himself he had never examined. As the separation progressed, assets divided cleanly, responsibilities reassigned, futures clarified, she felt a strange lightness, not joy, but relief, the relief of no longer carrying someone else's deception as invisible weight. He, on the other hand, felt exposed, not because secrets had been shouted, but because silence had done its work, and the realization that she had seen him clearly long before he ever saw himself became a quiet torment. The world adjusted around them, as worlds always do, accommodating new realities without ceremony, and in that adjustment lay the final lesson he was still learning, that power is not loud, revenge is not chaotic, and the most complete upheaval often looks, from the outside, like a calm and reasonable ending. And as she stepped fully into her new life, leaving behind the version of herself that had once trusted blindly, she knew the last piece was not about him at all. It was about choosing never again to mistake silence for weakness. In the months that followed, the world settled into a new rhythm that felt unfamiliar yet unmistakably right, as if reality itself had been waiting for this correction to occur. And she moved through it with a steadiness that surprised even her, because the absence of constant vigilance felt like freedom rather than loss. She no longer measured her days by his moods or his needs, no longer adjusted her tone to keep peace, no longer wondered what truth might be hiding behind a smile, and that clarity sharpened everything else, her decisions, her instincts, her sense of self. Professionally, she flourished, not in dramatic leaps but in sustained momentum, the kind that signals permanence, earning respect that was no longer borrowed or shared. And people began to speak of her, not in relation to him, but as an authority in her own right, which quietly rewrote the story he once told himself about being the center of their shared success. He attempted distance at first, then reconciliation, then distance again, cycling through emotions that mirrored the stages of grief, and she met each phase with consistent boundaries, neither cruel nor accommodating, simply firm, because boundaries, once established, do not require explanation. When they interacted, which became increasingly rare, she noticed how carefully he watched her, as if searching for cracks, for regret, for some sign that the past could be negotiated, and finding none unsettled him more than rejection ever could, because it suggested finality. The affair, now a closed chapter, had left him with a reputation he could not outrun, not because it was publicly condemned, but because trust, once questioned, lingers as an unspoken hesitation in every interaction, and that hesitation followed him into new spaces, new opportunities, new relationships, all subtly altered by the echo of who he had been. She felt no need to monitor his decline or his attempts at reinvention, because her focus had shifted entirely forward, toward a future designed with intention rather than reaction, and that shift marked the true end of the revenge, because revenge that continues to look backward is unfinished, One evening, long after the legalities were complete and the emotional dust had settled, she sat alone in a quiet apartment that felt unmistakably hers, reflecting not on what she had taken from him, but on what she had reclaimed for herself: dignity, agency, silence without fear. And she understood then that the most powerful outcome was not his loss, but her independence from the need to see him lose. The final encounter came unexpectedly, a chance meeting in a public space where politeness replaced intimacy, and as they spoke briefly about neutral topics, she saw acceptance in his eyes, not peace, but resignation, the understanding that some doors close without slamming, and that this closure is the hardest to contest. He wished her well, genuinely, and she returned the sentiment without bitterness, because wishing someone well does not negate accountability, it simply confirms growth. When they parted, there was no dramatic farewell, no lingering glance, just two lives continuing on separate trajectories, one shaped by awareness gained too late, the other by awareness seized at exactly the right moment. In the days that followed, she felt a deep certainty settle in her, the kind that comes not from victory, but from alignment, knowing that she had responded to betrayal not by diminishing herself, but by expanding beyond the space it tried to confine her to. The story, when viewed from the outside, would appear quiet, almost uneventful. No public scandals, no explosive revelations, no obvious villain, and yet beneath that calm surface lay a complete inversion of power, a life turned upside down piece by piece, not through chaos, but through clarity. She had discovered his affair, yes, but more importantly, she had discovered herself, her capacity for patience, for strategy, for choosing restraint over reaction, and that discovery outlasted every consequence he faced. If there was a lesson in how it ended, it was this: that the most devastating revenge is not destruction, it is transformation, because when one person evolves beyond the version of themselves that tolerated betrayal, the other is left alone with the weight of what they failed to value. And as this chapter closed fully, without loose ends or lingering bitterness, it became clear that the life she now lived was not built on revenge at all, but on the refusal to ever again surrender her power quietly. If this story held you until the end, if you felt the slow burn and the silent shifts, then like the video, subscribe for more stories like this, and comment what moment changed everything for you, because sometimes the quietest decisions create the loudest endings.